everyone. Thanks for being here. We're excited to introduce Lauren Smith DiCarlo, and she is a restoration ecologist who specializes in restoring and conserving habitat for rare wildlife species. She earned a doctorate degree at Oregon State University in wildlife science and has spent the past 8 years studying restoration techniques and the impact of arid grassland restoration has on pollinator communities. She currently teaches environmental science and oversees the restoration ecology program at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. So thanks for being with us today, and take it away.
Great, thanks so much. I'm happy to be here. Let me share my screen. All right. So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this. So I've been working really closely with Sandy DeBano. She is located at the Hermiston Agricultural Research and Extension Center at Oregon State University. She's developed many of these projects with me. And then we also work very closely with Skylar Burrows, who is from the USDA Bee Lab. And he has done much of the bee identification for us. So as you'll see, we've collected tens of thousands of bees throughout these studies, and it's almost impossible to get through all of those and identify all of those species, and we wouldn't be able to do that without him. So first, I just want to give you a little overview of some of the past and current projects that we've been working on. So I'll touch on a few of these today, including what we've found for native bee response to arid grassland restoration, and also a little bit of work that we've done within field margins in agricultural and natural areas. But we've also done some work, and you can see some publications of ours on the impact wildfire has on native bee communities, and then also some management implications that there may be with wildlife and native bees. So basically looking at a diet overlap of large mammals. So today I'm going to chat about native bees. So what do we know? Give a brief overview of the restoration of grasslands and agroecosystems. And then I'll also share some of the research that we've done and some of the results, focusing on some field margin studies and then some local and regional studies that assessed grassland restoration. And I'll end with some recommendations that we have based on these results. So first off, why should we care about bees? And what do we currently know? So generally, I think in the past decade or so, it's become pretty common knowledge that there are issues with bee populations across the globe. Most people know that there is specifically concerns with the European honeybee, so the bee that we rely most on for pollination within the US. And this bee was originally introduced from Europe, and there's been several issues specifically with colony collapse disorder, and there's multiple hypotheses about what is causing this, including different tracheal mites or varroa mites, maybe some insufficient rest and nutrition or insecticide exposure. What many people don't know, but is starting to become more common knowledge, is that there's actually a really large diversity of bees. So instead of just the one honeybee, we actually have over 4,000 species of bees within North America, 20,000 worldwide. So there's more species than both bird and mammal species combined. And in New Mexico, there's about 1,100 species. So over 25% of the species in North America can be found in New Mexico. So it's very diverse. So with biodiversity, we have some aesthetic value. So you can see here, there's many different bees that come in different colors, different sizes, and they all like different flowers. And what this translates into is money. So here's just a few things that I found that you can purchase. So based on this biodiversity, so increasing the amount of bee species maybe you find in your backyard. So for example, you might be able to find a solitary beehive, maybe even buy a bee chalet or cottage, make your own cookies, which would germinate, so putting seeds in those, different colorful native bee plates. And then there's also a large number of books that have been coming out lately. For example, The Bees in Your Backyard, that provides a really nice overview and photographs of bees that you can find. And of course, we also get a lot of services from this large biodiversity of bees. So in the US, each year, the pollination of just our agricultural crops is estimated to be a $235 to $515 billion industry. And we rely on pollinators, so insect pollinators specifically, to pollinate 65% of our crops and also 88% of our wild plants. And you can see here that in some crops that can be both self, wind, or insect pollinated, insect pollinators can actually improve what we see as a good fruit or something that we might want to buy at a grocery store. And we have other advantages as well of native bees. So because they're so diverse, say if we see future declines in honeybees, they might be able to act as an insurance policy. So maybe taking over pollination within our crops. They can also forage a lot earlier or at different times than honeybees. So on days that are maybe very windy, wet, we can see bees, these native bees, still visiting flowers. And they can even make honeybees forage more efficiently. So in some crops, such as sunflower crops, we can see these native bees chasing around the honeybees, forcing them to move between male and female parts of the flowers. And in hybrid sunflower seed crops, only the fields with both a lot of native bees and honeybees had a 100% seed set. And in some cases, they're actually better pollinators for some of our crops. So again, another example, if we have an acre of apple, so an apple orchard, we may need up to 20,000 honeybees to pollinate that orchard, but only 250 orchard mason bees. So why are they so much more efficient? Mainly because of buzz pollination. So if you think of a bumblebee in the distinctive buzz that it has, this is an adaptation that the bumblebees have evolved with these specific crops and flowers, where they can go up, grab the stamens of the flowers, they'll vibrate, giving that buzz sound, and the pollen will be released. And so you can see this in several different crops like blueberries, cranberries, tomatoes, and peppers. Honeybees are not able to do this buzz pollination. And then we also see that certain bees are more specialists. So they're not generalists that will move to, say, or pollinate multiple crops or plants, but they might be specialists on a specific plant species or plant family. And so they've evolved this particular morphology or behavior to pollinate these particular plants. Maybe they have longer tongues that can reach inside the plant. Maybe their bodies are smaller, so they can have easier access. They can actually enter inside the flower. So these are just some of the ways that they might be more efficient. So what do bees actually need? So we know they need three things. They need a place to live, so a nesting site. And this could be someplace in the ground. It could be in a plant, or even at the base of a plant, like in the base of this bunch grass I have here. They need a place to find dates or a mating site. And we know some bumblebees will mark non-flowering areas in the landscape to find mates or to meet a mate. And they also need food. So nectar for energy and pollen for protein, which they'll also bring back to their larvae. And so when we're thinking about restoration and what we can improve for bees, two things come up. So we can improve nesting sites, so the landscape around maybe some areas that we'd like to improve or increase the bee species or abundance of bees. And we can also change or provide more food, so more flowering resources that they might be able to use. So thinking about floral resources, there are a few things we know. So for example, we know there are a lot of bee species. At one of our locations in Eastern Oregon, over several years, we've documented over 170 species. We know that these species are active at different times of the season. And we also know that they vary in their dietary preferences. However, very little is known about which flowers each bee species prefers. So we don't really know what most bee species like, and we don't know how that varies regionally or even seasonally. So there have been a lot of books that have come out lately that provide recommendations maybe on what to plant in a garden to improve your garden for pollinators. But a lot of these are based on anecdotal evidence, maybe a small number of bee species, or even information from other regions. So because of this, there's been a huge effort across the US to try to understand which bee species prefer which flowers, so we can properly enhance pollinator habitat. And so in Eastern Oregon, there have been multiple restoration projects that have tried to improve habitat, not only for pollinators, but for other wildlife as well. Three that I'm going to focus on today are in Eastern Oregon. So these are the Umatilla National Wildlife Refuge, the Nature Conservancy Boardman Preserve, and then also the Nature Conservancy Zumwalt Prairie. All of these have arid and semi-arid grassland. So in arid grassland, they receive on average about 8 inches of precipitation a year. Semi-arid up to about 20 inches, and most of this occurs during the winter. There's also some sagebrush steppe habitat in the area. And then in addition to that, there's also lots of agriculture. So here in this photo, you can actually see two of our restoration locations. So there's the Umatilla National Wildlife Refuge. Down here on the bottom left is the Nature Conservancy Boardman Preserve. You'll notice all of the different crop circles surrounding them. So these areas are along the Columbia River in Oregon. So a really high agricultural area. There's over 100 different crops grown in this region, primarily potatoes, but also Hermiston, Oregon, which is located right here, considers themselves the watermelon capital of the world. So we're seeing a lot of diversity in our crops, but just notice this is a highly agricultural area. So many of these areas that are being restored back to grasslands, which they were prior to this agriculture moving in there. So in North America, over 99% of our grasslands have been declined, primarily due to agricultural conversion. Currently, the grasslands that remain have threats of invasive annual grasses. So here in this photo, you can see a pretty healthy grassland. So you can see the different bunch grasses. Notice that there's space between each of them, and you can see some maybe bare ground between them. With invasive annual grasses, the landscape completely changes. Notice you don't see those bunch grasses anymore. There's no space in between. So this is an invasion of cheatgrass, which is one of our primary invasives in these areas. But other threats include woody encroachment and then also altered fire regimes. Within these different grasslands and grassland restorations, there's been a lot of monitoring of endangered species, especially vertebrate species, including rodents and then also many bird species. But there's been very little done and there's very little known about how this restoration impacts native bee communities. So we know very little about how restoration impacts bee communities. We don't even know what species are present. And if we're trying to, say, improve an area or restore it to help increase the number of bee species that are present, we're not really sure what variables are associated with these communities. We can make some guesses. So with bees, maybe some variables that might be associated would be floral abundance and diversity. However, quite a few studies have not found correlations with bee abundance and diversity in the floral resources. So what I believe, and so why not everyone is seeing, say, a higher abundance of bees and diversity if you plant, say, more flowers or a greater variety of flowers, is that there's something else going on that bees need. So thinking back to those nesting, the nesting habitat, we might also assume that bees might be associated with nesting resources. So things like bare ground, maybe those bunch grasses, and then also maybe vegetation height. So we know some bees like to nest in, say, dead wood that's still standing. And then they also like to forage. Some bees like to forage on the ground. Some bees like to forage up higher. And determining what these variables are is really important, especially if we want the restoration to be a success, because many of these bees are going to be pollinating the plants that have been planted during the restoration. So with this, we had 3 primary objectives. So the first, just describe what the bee communities are in these grasslands and agroecosystems. Determine how grassland restoration impacts these communities and assess which habitat variables are strongly associated with them. That way we can know what we need to target and what we need to change during restoration to improve the bee communities. So first, I'm going to talk about a field margin study. So this is focusing on our first objective, just trying to figure out what bee species are even present in this area. So I used 2 different sites. So the restoration sites, the Umatilla National Wildlife Refuge and the Nature Conservancy Boardman Preserve. And within this, we took a look at what bees were located in field margins. So field margins are just the sides of agricultural fields. In Eastern Oregon, since a crop or circular system is used, oftentimes these are small triangular areas along the sides. But in different cropping systems, like say in Europe, we oftentimes see these different windbreaks. So it might be very different. Field margins could be any of these types or any area that's just not cultivated next to a field. So these areas can be pretty important. So generally, they're used to allow equipment to turn around, maybe to store something. Oftentimes in Eastern Oregon, you see hay bales stored in the corners there. But they also provide some benefits. So they can reduce soil erosion and runoff on the farm. They do harbor weeds, but they also harbor native plants as well. And they can contain a lot of diversity, so both for plants and wildlife. And they can provide refuge for wildlife, especially invertebrates. So you can find a lot of invertebrates, especially in the winter. So these areas are important overwintering sites. So first, let me just tell you a little bit about these sites that we're working in. So the Nature Conservancy Boardman Preserve is a pretty large arid grassland. Historically, it was a naval bombing range, which is why there's still areas of intact grassland that has not been converted to agriculture. You'll notice next to it, there's a pretty large farm. So this area here. So this farm is one of the largest farms in the country that produces potatoes. It produces 90% of all of our organic frozen vegetables, and it's also the third largest dairy in the country as well. So it's a pretty large area, and they actually own the land that is part of the Nature Conservancy Preserve. They lease it out to the Nature Conservancy each year and provide funding to restore and also conserve the area in order to get water rights from the Columbia River so they can continue to irrigate. And I'm happy to chat more about that later if anyone is interested. But the native bunch grasses we can find here include blue bunch wheatgrass, needle and threadgrass, Sandberg's bluegrass, and then we have those exotic species I mentioned before, so those annual grasses, which include cheatgrass and medusa head. The Umatilla National Wildlife Refuge is also quite large. Historically, it was grazed and cultivated. Currently, there's still a few crops on the area, so you'll notice these 5 crop circles here. They're still used today, and they're rented out to a farmer who is required to leave 25% of the crop each year for food for migrating waterfowl. Similar to the Boardman Preserve, there's the same native bunch grasses and the same exotic species, so those invasive annual grasses. So what we did, we went out and collected bees within the crops. So within the crop fields, within those field margins, and also in those neighboring grassland areas, so those preserves. And we collected bees using elevated pan traps. So pan traps are just plastic cups that are painted fluorescent yellow, blue, and white to attract different pollinators. And they're filled with a solution of water and detergent. The detergent breaks the surface tension, so when the pollinator lands inside the cup, they fall into the water. We left these out in the field for 2 days and then collected them. And you'll notice that we always do 3 collection periods. So we have an early season, June to July collection, a mid-season, July to August, and then late season, August to September. And we did this study in 2016. We also did some floral resource surveys. So we went and looked at all of the different flowering plants that we could find. We identified them, and then we also did some hand netting. So to try to determine which bee species prefer which plants, we went out, observed plants, and captured any bees that we saw pollinating them. So over the course of those 3 collection periods, we collected over 10,000 individuals, and we found 61 bee species from 5 different families. The majority of bees that we caught were collected in July, August, so that mid-season collection period. And then we also identified 33 different flowering species and observed 140 pollination events. So we observed a bee pollinating a certain species of flower. So let me just give you a quick overview of the 5 families. So we found 5 different families: Andrenidae, Apidae, Callididae, Helictidae, and Megachelidae. And I'm going to just give you a brief background about each of these families so you know a little bit more about the bees we're dealing with. So first, the Andrenidae. These are referred to as the mining bees, and we found 4 species, all from the same genus, the Perdita genus. These are known to be extreme specialists in certain areas. So in some instances, maybe they only pollinate one species of flowers. They're also solitary, so they don't live in hives like you think of honeybees or bumblebees. They nest in the ground, and they're also very small, so less than 2 millimeters long. Oftentimes they're mistaken for flies. Next, we have the Apidae. So this is a family that most people are familiar with. It includes the bumblebees and also the honeybee. And we found several different species. So we only found 2 bumblebee species. There's 20 in Oregon. And then we also found quite a few of these Melisode species. So 13 out of the 25 that are known to be in Oregon. These are referred to as the longhorned bees. You can see that here. So in the males, they have these really long antennae. They're also solitary and nest in the ground. And they're known to be a specialist on Asteraceae, so the daisy family. We also found Helictidae, so 4 species of Cleides, but we actually only collected 4 individuals from this family. They're pretty common worldwide. So there's over 700 species worldwide, quite a few in Australia, only about 100 in North America. Not a lot is known about them. They are solitary. They're also ground nesters, but you can find them in aggregations, so nesting in the ground around other individuals. Then we have Helictidae. So this is the most abundant family that we collected and found. So these are referred to as the sweat bees. And primarily we collected only Lasioglossum and Agapossamum genera. So the Lasioglossum is on the top there, the Agapossamum is below. And these are solitary, maybe communal. So again, nesting in areas with others. They do nest in the ground, and they're known to be generalists. Oftentimes people refer to these as maybe junk bees. So maybe they're found in really degraded areas. And really it's because they're generalists. They might pollinate many different species of flowers. And then lastly, we have the Megachelidae. So these are known as the mason bees. Unlike the other species, they build their nests above ground. So maybe in some dead wood that they might find or in a tree. They are solitary, and they collect their pollen on their abdomen instead of on their legs. So a lot of the other bee species, so if you think of a bumblebee, they actually take the pollen and they stick it in little, almost like little bags on the back of their legs as they're pollinating or moving around. So here I have a graph showing our total abundance of each of these families and the 3 collection periods. So overall, we collected the most bees during that mid-collection period, July to August, but that wasn't really the trend for all of the different families. So you'll notice like the Apidae family, there were more individuals in August to September. But this trend is really driven by that Helictidae. So again, that was the most common family that we collected. And they were really prevalent in July to August. So thinking about the flowers or the floral resources that the bees would use in these areas, again, we identified 33 different flowering species. And we found that in the uncultivated areas, so those field margins or the grasslands, there was about 15% forb cover. So 15% of the ground cover was flowering species. 50% of these were introduced or exotic species. And out of the 140 pollinator events, we collected bees on 14 flowering species, 8 of which were exotic, and 15% of those events were on introduced or exotic species of flowering plants. And here are the plants that we find in the area. So most of these you'll notice are asters or that daisy family. So we have green rabbit brush, sagebrush mariposa lily, common yarrow. And a lot of these are planted in our restoration areas. There's also hairy false golden aster, hoary tansy aster, wavy leaf thistle. Notice that all these flowers, there's different colors, there's different flower types. And then for the introduced plants, primarily we were seeing yellow star thistle, tall tumbleweed, and diffuse snapweed. What's interesting is that we actually didn't see the same trend in flowering plants as we saw with the bees. So I mentioned towards the beginning of the talk that a lot of research has not found that with more flowering resources, you'll find more bees. And we didn't find that here. So with the bees, we saw that the most were collected July and August, so highest abundance there. But with the flowering plants, we actually found that there were more in August to September. So there's a few things that might be going on here. Maybe that this trend was really swung by us collecting a lot of those sweat bees during July and August. But clearly other things are going on in the background, which is what we're trying to figure out. So what are these other variables that are correlated with the bee communities, and what is something that we can alter or change in the restoration process so we can make sure that we're really increasing the diversity of bees in these areas and also the abundance. So in summary for this project, we found bees from 5 different families, mainly those sweat bees, and then also longhorned bees, which are Asteraceae specialists, so the daisy specialists. And we found bees on both native and introduced species. And we found a disconnect here. So bees were more abundant during July and August, whereas flowers were more abundant in August to September. So now moving on and focusing on how restoration in these areas are impacting the bee species. So first, I'm going to only talk about one of these restoration project locations, which is the Nature Conservancy Boardman Preserve. So this is the one that was historically the naval bombing range and has this large farm next to it. From 2006 to 2012, the Nature Conservancy took on some pretty large restoration projects. So they restored 6 areas ranging from 23 to 42 hectares. And what they did was they went in, sprayed the area with an herbicide to kill all of the invasive grass species. So primarily they targeted areas that were really degraded. So looked like this, mostly had really high cover of these invasive grass species. After they killed off these grasses, they then went in, seeded with native bunch grasses and flowering plants, or also known as forbs. So just as a comparison, this would be a degraded site. Here's our native site. So again, good bunch grasses. And then there's also the restoration sites. So we did the same thing. So we collected bees with these elevated pan traps over the same time periods. We did this for a 3-year, over 3 years, so 2014 to 2016. In each of our areas, so degraded, native, and restored, we chose 6 different plots. In each plot, we had 9 of these elevated pan traps. And we also did a 50 by 50 meter square around this plot orientation here. And within this 50 by 50 meter square around all of our traps, we did some floral resource surveys. So we counted and identified all of the flowering plants. And then we also did some vegetation surveys. And within this, we estimated the percent invasive annual grass cover, litter cover, biological soil crust cover. Biological soil crusts are things like mosses, lichens, cyanobacteria that you can find in these grassland ecosystems, which they're really quite cool. You wouldn't know that they were there. But there's a few up in here in this upper left quadrant. We also estimated the percent forb cover and the maximum vegetation height. So just to see if any of these variables correlated with the bee community. So over this time period, we collected almost 13,000 bees, and we identified 62 species from 5 families. So really similar to the field margin study I just mentioned, only 1 additional species. And we found that the major genera included those sweat bees, so the Agapossumum and Lasioglossum, those generalists again. And then longhorned bees. So these were more specialists on the asters, so the Asteraceae family. And what we also found was that within the bee community, there is really strong seasonal and interannual variations. So we could see changes in abundance, richness, so the number of bee species collected, the diversity, and even the composition. So really different communities throughout the season. So those early, mid, and late sampling periods. And again, just like our prior study in the field margins, these trends didn't correspond with the floral variation. So say we found, again, more bees, so like a higher abundance in that mid sampling period, June to July, or July to August, we didn't necessarily see more flowers at that time period. What we did find were that sites with higher levels of litter had more bees, so higher abundance, and sites that had taller vegetation. So in this case, the taller vegetation is primarily those bunch grasses. So they're taller than the invasive annual grasses. So sites that had taller vegetation or more blooming flowers had a greater bee species richness, so a greater number of bee species. Overall, for restoration, we found that there was no difference between the abundance, number of species, so richness or diversity. So there's no difference between the degraded, restored, and native sites. However, we did see a difference in the bee and floral communities, where there were different communities and species present in the native sites than the degraded and restored, but there was no difference between the degraded and restored sites for either the bees or the floral communities. So what does that mean? Well, with grassland restoration, if we're trying to, say, provide a benefit to the bees, if we want the bee communities to change and improve, maybe mimic those native sites, we need to make sure that the restoration projects are changing. So right now they still very much are similar to the degraded sites. So over time, hopefully they will change, but we might not see the change unless we expand the floral resources. So just not only the number of flowering plants, but also maybe the species that we're planting there, and also enhancing some of those variables that influence nesting habitat. So areas that had more litter, changing things like that might provide more of an effect from restoration. So lastly, looking back to these restoration sites, that was only looking at one location, so the Nature Conservancy Boardman Preserve. We wanted to see if we saw the same results regionally, so within these other locations. So this is some preliminary data. We're still looking into this. Remember, here's one of our sites, the Umatilla National Wildlife Refuge. So this was the refuge that had a little bit of agriculture on it, where the farmer was required to leave a quarter of all the crops for migrating waterfowl. We also looked at this Nature Conservancy Zumwalt Prairie, another really large grassland area, no longer cultivated. However, it is still currently grazed. And all of these sites did very similar restoration projects. So bringing in an herbicide, killing off the invasive grasses, then going in, seeding native grasses and some flowering plants. Here we see a little bit different exotic species. So intermediate wheatgrass is one, ventinata is another. This site is at a little bit higher elevation, so it's more semi-arid than arid. So comparing to the other two, this is the site that receives about 20 inches of rain a year compared to 8 on average. So looking at our results, so we collected bees in each of 3 of these locations in 2015. We collected over 6,000 bees. We found 90 species from the same 5 families and pretty similar genera. So again, we have the sweat bees. We've added one here, which is the Helictidae species. And then we also have the longhorn bee as well. A little bit different composition here. So not quite as many longhorn bees, a lot more sweat bees. For the floral resources, we identified over 17,000 blooming stems. We found 15% of these were non-native. Some of the common ones, Idaho gumweed, common yarrow, and slender cinquefoil. So most of these were asters. So most of the flowering plants were. We identified 63 flowering plant species. And out of these common species I just mentioned, the yarrow and Idaho gumweed are asters. The slender cinquefoil is actually in the rose family. So how does restoration affect bees? Well, we really found the same thing we saw in the one location. So we're still not seeing that the bee communities are impacted by these different treatments. So the restoration treatment is not making a difference in the community yet. It still closely resembles that degraded community. In the native community is still different. So over time, we would hope to see that the bee community in these restored sites starts to resemble the native communities. We're just not seeing that yet. And similarly to our other study, there is no difference in the abundance, richness, and diversity of the bees within the degraded, restored, and native sites. We did see a little bit of a different result where the floral communities didn't differ between the treatments either in this regional study, where the floral community was pretty similar to the bee community with only using one site, where the native sites were again different than the restored and degraded. So just some general conclusions. First off, we found that bees were very useful for monitoring restoration treatments. So bees and invertebrates in general can respond very quickly to restoration, much faster than say, vertebrates and vegetation. So they can be useful to track changes within the environment. Currently, we did not see that grassland restoration is impacting the bee community. So in the future, restoration efforts need to change to make sure that these communities are starting to mimic the native area bee communities. And ways that we could do that is by providing more diverse floral forage, so a higher diversity of flowering plants, make sure that there's enough blooms during times when bees are more abundant. So we want to make sure that there's vegetation that's blooming throughout the growing season. And then also making sure that we're also doing some changes within the nesting habitat. So most of our bees are ground nesters. So looking at things like leaf litter and then also taller vegetation. So in our case, this would be the native bunch grasses are the tallest here. So making sure that we're removing all of those invasive annual grasses and focusing more on bunch grasses where many bees may nest at the base of those bunch grasses. So things that we can do to help the bees. So in these areas, a lot of pesticides and herbicides are used. So making sure that we're using the best application practices, limiting our spraying during those busy time periods, so July to August, or when we see flowers blooming in those field margins. We can also limit our spraying during active periods. Many of these bees are most active in the late afternoon. And then we can also use pesticides that are more bee friendly. So perhaps having a shorter half-life. And some researchers at Oregon State have created this app called Bee Safety, which is really great. You can take a look at which herbicides or insecticides you're using and see if it's safe for bees. We can also make sure that we're reducing damage to field margins. So again, this is an area where a lot of bees nest in the ground. So limiting tillage in those areas or mowing or moderating driving, which might compact the soil, can help. And then of course, also being able to plant more bee-friendly plants in these areas or protecting them. So protecting plants, especially that we know that the bees will use, like those asters. And this might provide benefits for the cropping systems as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, having these native bees and a diversity of these native bees can really improve and enhance pollination within the cropping fields. And here's just an example. So in California, we're seeing several wineries starting to utilize these areas that are uncultivated, so in between the grapevines, and they're planting some native flowering plants specifically for bee habitat. And lastly, we're lucky we've gotten a lot of support for these projects and a lot of funding by different groups, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Western SARE, USDA, and the Nature Conservancy. And so with that, I will end things, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, that was great. We do have some questions for you in the chat. I guess before we get to that though, I'm gonna put a survey in the comment box for everyone. If you could take that, let us know what you think. It's how we help to create our programming. And if you add your address, we also have some seeds and pollinator booklets to send you. You don't have to take the survey to get the stuff, but either way. So yeah, we have a few questions. John's going to help me with these, but the first one is about herbicide application. So could herbicide application be more critical than initially thought? And might it be better to have invasive or non-native plants than apply herbicides?
So it really is herbicide dependent. So we have to look closely at what herbicides we're using and see how they specifically impact bees. Some are more harmful than others, depending on their residual toxicity. So if we're looking at an herbicide label, oftentimes you can see how toxic they are to bees. Oftentimes I get the question during these talks of, especially about the restoration areas, well, if we're using herbicide to get rid of the invasives, aren't we also impacting the bee community? And the answer is yes, we are. But we have to weigh the benefits, costs and benefits, because if we don't use the herbicide, it's very unlikely that we can get rid of those invasive species. And that's just kind of what we have to do in restoration.
Yeah, it's kind of a cost benefit. Here's another pesticide related one. So when you're looking at herbicide and pesticide toxicity to bees, are you just looking at lethal effect, or is lower fitness considered?
Usually it's lethal effect.
Okay. How about with so I know Oregon's also semi-arid like we are here in New Mexico. But was the water availability on your study sites roughly the same? And if not, did you notice any correlation with bee count?
So it was roughly the same between all the sites. These are pretty arid locations, very limited by water. What was the second part of that question?
Was there a correlation between bee and water? I guess the water was similar, so
it was similar. And you know, during these periods where we collected bees, there was no water at all. So there's just no precipitation in the summer.
We get that. We get that too.
I bounce off of that one and ask about soil types. Did you see similar soil types between sites? So and whether or not that might have had an impact?
Yeah, there are different soil types, especially at our higher elevation site. I didn't really look at that very much because we had other people doing that work, so I can't really speak to that. But yes, there are definitely different soil types. The area is pretty sandy, so due to recent ice ages and flooding, there's a lot of nutrients in the soil, which is also why it's so good for agriculture. But it is really sandy, almost like walking on a beach.
Great, thank you. We have a couple great questions from Yasmin. And so the first one she has is, how can we find out more about what bees use or pollinate particular crops and other words that would attract those species in hedgerows, etc.?
Yes, so that's a great question. Right now, the USDA Bee Lab in Utah is putting together a great resource. So, and actually, I can put it in the chat too. So there's this website called bugguide.net. And I just posted it in the chat. And in that, you can say you have a bee that you've identified or you think you know what it is. You can go through that and go down to the very bottom of the bee species page. And there is a list of all of the different flowering plants that bee has been found on. So if you have a specific plant that you want to know what bee species have been found on it, you can go and use that resource.
Great. And it looks like in the chat, Dana also mentioned that xerces.org and the Santa Fe Master Gardeners have great plant lists. So for the New Mexico area, people are looking for that. Another question Yasmin had was, what flowering species were blooming during bee collection in July and August? And I was trying to think back to what site she was talking about, but I don't know if you might know what she's.
Yeah, yep. So the majority of plants that are blooming during that period are common, well, the most prevalent, I would say, is common yarrow. So that's one that was planted in the restoration sites. We actually didn't collect that many bees off of it, but almost all of the recommendations during these grassland restoration plantings, like the first flowering plant they always recommend is common yarrow. And I think it's because it's one that grows really quickly and pretty well in these areas, but we really didn't see many bees on the plant. One that we did find a lot of bees on was the green and gray rabbit brushes. So this is a pretty common plant, especially in sagebrush steppe habitat. Yeah, tons of bees on those.
I think we see that here too on our rabbit brush.
Yeah, there are also a few questions about litter. A couple just asked if you could define litter, and then how can you increase it?
Yeah, so litter would just be any kind of dead vegetation. And so in our areas, most of the dead vegetation is just from dying grasses. So increasing the number of bunch grasses that will slowly die over time, that can increase the litter. Also increasing the number of flowering plants.
I filled that form out, and I want to tell you, it has these 2 boxes that have a
Right. So also increasing the number of flowering plants will increase litter as well. So as they die, one thing to mention is that with the invasive annual grasses, they create almost a different type of litter. So as they die, they create this thatch underneath of the vegetation where almost nothing can get in through it. So that's not the type of litter we want. So making sure that we have those spaces between the bunch grasses and then litter being able to fall into that space is what bees seem to prefer.
It's really interesting. And that, yeah, I hadn't thought about different grasses having different litter, but that makes sense.
Once you have to walk through it, you notice the differences.
That's true. You start to see where there's spaces in between, or when you're tripping more often. Here's an interesting one. Can bees smell herbicide or in some way know to stay away from plants that have been sprayed?
That's a good question. And I actually don't know the answer to that. I assume not, because we've seen incidences of bees still pollinating or visiting flowers after a pesticide spray, but I don't know enough to give an answer to that one.
I used to yell at butterflies when I was spraying thistles, and they would land on the flowers that I just sprayed. So, similar. Did you happen to run a test plot in adjacent farm crops?
Yes, we did, and I have not analyzed that data yet. So to come.
That's a lot of bees that you collect.
Right. So over the course of these studies, we've collected over 30,000 bees, which is a lot to identify. So it's just taking years to identify all of them.
Did you mention, are you doing it yourself, or do you have?
No, so luckily, one of my co-authors who works at the USDA Bee Lab, he is doing all of the identification for us, which is great because they have so many resources there that they can get it done much faster than what we could.
It's true. These are hard to, some of those comparisons.
Right.
Did you study a declined area first to have a comparison?
So we did it at the same time. So the degraded areas that we studied with those invasive annual grasses, those were the declined areas. And they're being compared to the native sites, which are healthy grassland sites, and then also the restored areas.
And then someone said, thank you. This was excellent.
Thanks.
So I am looking through the comments. Here's this is, why are Helictidae called sweat bees?
That's a good question. It's kind of like an old wives' tale that they're attracted to sweat. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
I'm not sure if we already answered this question because it looked like Nancy had another question. Do you know if anyone has done similar counts to numbers and diversity for those bees in the crops in that area? I'm not sure if we touched on that yet.
No, they haven't. There's been very little work with bees in that area in general. And in arid grasslands in general, for that matter. There's been a lot of work, in the Midwest with grasslands, but those are very different systems than what we see in these arid grasslands. But no, there has not been any work in the Oregon area. There has been some work in California that I know of, but again, very different systems.
And it looks like we have a few more questions. This is a comment question, I think. It says the herbicide on the degraded site could change the soil microbial scene and thereby affect the plants that are growing, and thus the bees could be responding to that change.
So in the degraded sites, there actually was not any herbicide used. Herbicide was only used in the restored sites. The herbicide that's used degrades very quickly. So it should not be impacting any plants that germinate.
And then we have another question that says, how can you conclude that restoration needs more flowers if you don't see differences?
So we do see a difference between our native or healthy sites in the flower composition. So we're seeing different flowers within those healthy sites compared to what we're seeing in the restored sites. So the restored flowering composition is similar to the degraded. So what I think is happening here is that when we're going in and restoring and seeding or putting in flowering plants, we're not putting in the same ones we're seeing in the native sites. So we're using, say, maybe a seed mix that you would get from like a large manufacturer, where it might include some of the species, but not all of them that we want. They might not be local species. So we need to really look more closely at what each of those species are and try to mimic that.
And then you were also saying that, it might take longer to get to a fully restored site, right? Until you're getting into that, that native comparison.
Right. And it still really hasn't been that much time since these restoration projects. So some of these seeds can lay dormant for decades in the soil. So what we've seeded initially during those restoration sites, we might not see these flowering plants come back for decades. They just need that proper environmental condition. Maybe they need some kind of frost at a certain time of year. Maybe they need a fire to come through. So this area, there have been fires in the past there, but generally, since there's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of fire suppression. So that they're not trying to stop these fires, but historically, these areas would burn every 1 to 2 years. So many seeds rely on fire to germinate.
So this kind of leads into a question that I was thinking about. And as a land manager, it's something that I've been kind of mulling over on how to translate some of the great things that you've said. So you mentioned a lot of great recommendations and tips kind of from your conclusions. But for land managers, and this might be a tough question, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. How would you suggest us, trying to communicate to land managers the importance of spending time and resources, to looking at these in-between areas and spending, especially as limited water use and all of that, to try to get these, pollinator plants established, or, spend time on trying to really alter their spraying applications, and change kind of what they're doing. What would you say might be a way to kind of convince or get that message across?
Good question. And I think the first thing is always to look at low cost options, right? So any way that you can save a farmer money, that's usually the best way to go. And so actually nearby one of our sites, there is a farm that's been restoring their field margins. And what they've been doing, and it's actually, they have these days where other farmers can come, they can tour the area. And there's been some studies that have begun, they haven't been published yet, that have been looking at how the crops have been pollinated in these areas compared to others where their field margins haven't been restored. And there's some really interesting things happening within this farm. So they're seeing a lot of invertebrate species. They're seeing a lot of invertebrates that are really good at controlling pests. So they can reduce the number of pests in the crop. So the crops are doing really well. And so it seems like once you get one group, or say one person started, then it can start, a domino effect. But I agree, it's very difficult at the beginning. And I think just being able to maybe set aside a field margin for a year just to see what comes up. So like what germinates if you don't mow it can be helpful as well. So I think it's also oftentimes surprising to see all of the native plants that are actually there. So I think we oftentimes think, oh, there's just going to be weeds in the field margin, but really there's a lot of native plants.
Yeah, when you just kind of let things take its course, you might be surprised.
Right. Yeah. And this farmer I'm referring to, he actually has gone in and seeded his field margins. So he hasn't just like let them grow up.
Right.
He's taken a more active role in it.
But it may take less water than you might think to get some of those native seeds established.
Right.
Because they should be able to be in there, and if you put the seed source back in, maybe.
Right. All of these native plants have evolved to be in this low water system. And oftentimes it's almost impossible to water these field margins. So you just need something that can survive the summer heat in droughts.
Looks like we have another great question. So from your gut feel, do you think you saw an increased population in the adjacent cropland over and above what was counted in the grassland?
So a larger population in the farming area?
Yeah, so it says, do you think you saw an increased population in the adjacent cropland over and above what was counted in the grassland?
No, I think it's actually lower. So and it all depends on what the crop is. So if it's a non-flowering crop or a crop that's not pollinated, there's not going to be a lot of pollinators in there because there's no floral resources for them. If it is a crop that is flowering, so say like a common one, well, two common ones we had were like alfalfa and buckwheat. There are a lot of pollinators in there. Not a huge diversity because the farmers are then bringing in honeybees to pollinate these areas. So there's a lot of competition for the native bees.
And I don't see any new questions, but there's a lot of great comments just thanking you for this amazing presentation. It seems like everybody enjoyed it and learned a lot.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and just to add on that, someone said too, they even learned things they can apply in their urban garden. So we reached a lot of people. So I guess, yes, thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us. I guess, so for those who are still on, we have Sean McCosham will be here on Thursday at 3 to talk more about pollinator habitat. He's done work in urban and agricultural settings. And with that, we'll see everyone on Thursday.